Ego deaths are not what you think they are. They are very necessary if you want to transform your self-concept in a lasting way, but there's a lot of misconceptions around them. Today, I'll tell you all about ego deaths, why you need them, what it really feels like, what it is, what it isn't, and how to use it to evolve your self-concept. Let's dive in. Hello my loves, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Lorena, I'm a somatic self-concept and identity coach, and I support you in bridging the gap between who you currently are or perceive yourself as and who you desire to be or become. So let's get some definitions out of the way before we dive into the concept of ego deaths and what it's like and why it's so useful and what it really means. I want to explore the connection between your ego and your self-concept. So your ego does give you a sense of personal identity. It is a part of how you see yourself, or it's a part of your mind. And it's really responsible for determining your place in connection to your external circumstances, other people, your reality. It creates a sense of separation, which is needed. You need that sense of separation so that you can have your own identity. But your ego is often a false perception of self. And so is often your self-concept. Your self-concept, your concept of yourself is the idea that you have of yourself. It's beliefs that you have about yourself. It's who you think you are. And that is constructed by past experiences, by often limiting beliefs, by programming from the past, by your ideas that you get from other people, messages and observations you make from other people. And for the most part, your ego identity and your self-concept are unconscious. There are certain things that you are aware of, but for the most part, it's unconscious, and that is only because you are so closely identified with it that you can't really see it. It's like when you're in the eye of the storm, you don't see the storm because you're in the middle of it. You're so identified with your ego and with your self-concept that you're not aware of it. You're not aware that it's not really who you are. So with that, I want to speak about the fact that the ego is not the enemy here. So although I'm speaking about ego deaths, this is not about killing the ego. Your ego isn't bad, and it's not about killing a part of you, but rather integrating it, changing your relationship to it and your perception of it, and even becoming aware of what's real and what isn't. So I really want to make clear that this video isn't against the ego. Even when you have an ego death, in the sense that I'm talking about it in this video, it's not about getting rid of your ego as a whole. It's more about shedding a part of your identity, dissolving a part of your identity that has often kept you small, but that has been so solidified in you that it feels impossible to release it, that you lose your sense of self when you release it. So this brings me to explaining what an ego death even is and what it feels like. So an ego death is the dissolution, the death of, or the disintegration of a part of your identity that you are so closely connected, so identified with, part of your personality or your self-concept that you are so identified with, that it feels like a loss of your sense of self. That is often something that you have been holding on to for years, often decades, maybe all your life, without necessarily being aware of the fact that it's just an identity that you've built and that it's not really who you are. Letting go of this part of yourself, first of all, it's really tricky sometimes to establish that there is even a false part of yourself or a false perception of who you are because of how closely you're identified with it. And then when you have it identified it's really hard to let go of it because then you're in the unknown. You need to rebuild your sense of self. So experiencing an ego death feels really jarring and often really painful. A self-concept shift without an ego death isn't really a self-concept shift. You cannot really transform your self-concept without letting a part of yourself die, because otherwise, if you're just trying to put something new on top of something that's still present, it's just surface level. It's like putting a plaster on without actually healing the wound. Now, why are ego deaths so painful? Because I said they're painful, right? It's because your ego will fight. This part of your self-concept, of your identity, will fight to survive because there is too much unknown when you let it go. And when you actually go through a self-concept rebirth, And that's what I do with my clients in Recreate Yourself. It is essentially a journey of dissolving parts of their identity, false parts of their identity, so that something new can be born. It does feel like a part of you is dying. This is why I call it death, even though we're not killing the ego, and why I'm making this distinction, because it does feel like a part of you dies. It feels like a death. I'm also curious if you've ever experienced this resistance, this fighting from your ego when you try to release an old version of yourself or a part of your self-concept, because it's going to do that. It tends to do that. It tends to resist. So share your story below. An ego death is also often what people speak about when they speak of a dark night of the soul. I remember when I had my first intense ego death, I honestly thought my whole world was falling apart. I was in this dark hole. I was completely confused. I could not stop crying. I did not really know who I was anymore. Everything felt confusing. And this is also why when you're really going through an ego death, you need support during this time, in my opinion. I definitely needed support because it can be so painful and also disorienting. People tend to talk about self-concept transformation as if it was a cute shift, as if you could just choose who you want to be and then you try it on and you try on this new identity and it's fun and you feel into it and you imagine and you visualize. And the truth is, if you're really transforming your self-concept, it's not pleasant. It's heavy, it's dark, and it's painful because of this ego death that happens, that has to happen if you want a sustained shift, a sustained self-concept transformation. So yeah, whilst it's painful, it's also really, really worth it because it is the path to really lasting transformation. And because of how painful it is, it's also often scary. If you want to learn more about the whole death and rebirth process that goes into transforming your self-concept, I actually have a free 2-day masterclass series on this called Metamorphosis, and you can receive the replay below. This is really a deep dive into it. But let's move on to talking about why an ego death is so necessary for self-concept transformation. Because in order to change your self-concept, you really need to let go of the identification that you have with a false part of yourself or a conditioned part of yourself. And when I say let go, it needs to die. It needs to dissolve because it will try to cling on so much that if you're just putting it into a corner and you're not truly dissolving it, you're not letting it die, it will come back around. And that's why you have so many people who keep repeating their patterns because that hasn't fully dissolved. It's also because the dissolving is more important than the active embodiment. If you're familiar with my coaching program or my work, then you may know, and if you don't, I've linked it below so you can check it out, that the active embodiment in the process I teach comes at the very end. Everything before then is about building a really solid foundation in your self-concept, and a big part of that is the dissolution of what is false, what is not really you, what is not authentic to who you are, of the conditioning, of the programming, of the emotional charges in your body, of the trauma that you've experienced. All these things need to be worked through and dissolved before you can actively embody something new. You could actively embody something new before doing that, but that's when you again tend to go back and forth. It tends to not be sustainable, or it tends to be very surface level. So your old self will try to keep holding on, and you can't become a new version of yourself if that is still holding on. So that's why it needs to be released, fully released. The other reason why it really needs to dissolve and why there really needs to be an ego death is because your ego as a whole, not just this part of your identity that you may want to let go of, it will deliberately keep you so closely identified with it because it's familiar, because it's comfortable, and because otherwise it needs to face the unknown. So in order to experience this rebirth, it's necessary. There can't be a birth without a death. There can't be a new beginning if there wasn't first an ending. And often we try to avoid the ending, right? Because endings can be so painful, just like an ego death is. But when you avoid the ending, you can't have a new beginning. It's as simple as that. You can't really hold two conflicting identities at the same time. One of them needs to be dissolved. So if you want to embody something new, dissolve the one that doesn't serve you. And dissolving doesn't happen through just choosing to let it go. The process that I teach my clients, even though I call it dissolving, it's actually much more a process of feeling and processing and integrating so that it changes shape. But that in itself feels disorienting because it feels like a death. But it's absolutely worth it, because after this ego death, you get to put yourself back together as a whole new version of yourself, as a more expanded, more embodied, more you version of yourself. It gives you more perspective, it makes you feel more grounded, and it makes you feel more whole because you've gotten to know the parts of yourself that you were previously identified with and that you didn't even know were holding you back. Going through this process also gives you immense confidence, and that also comes from the wholeness, because you're now in a place of embodied wholeness where you have full ownership of all parts of yourself, even parts you weren't even aware of. And you know how I already said that after every death comes a rebirth, and there's no rebirth without death? When I say rebirth, that means arising. You're rising like a phoenix from the ashes. That's absolutely worth it. Death isn't pretty, but it's also not the end. Just think about all of the amazing new beginnings that you're currently not experiencing, that you could be experiencing because they come out of your ego death. And overcoming a challenge like that also builds so much resilience and empowerment. How can you not feel amazing having risen from that? If you want to share what part of yourself you want to release, either hop into my Instagram DMs and share it with me there, or share a comment below, because I'd love to hear it all. In next week's video, we're going to talk about a quality that is so needed on your journey of transforming your self-concept that is often underestimated. So tune back in then, and I'll see you next week.